Hi, right. So what this is just part two of our little context unit for the Remember the Titans that Miss Callanan would have introduced to you a lesson or so ago. And this piece is called, or this section is called The South and the Civil War, and is just to, I guess, help you understand some of the context that leads up to some of those attitudes we see in Remember the Titans, and also kind of show you how they transition from having real and actual slavery, being a fact of particularly Southern life, to just having those attitudes, I guess, still remaining. And in there, what you see is a depiction of what I think is the Battle of Antietam, Antietam, maybe. And you can see the Confederate flag there, which has kind of become an image associated with, I guess, Southern pride, but also those racist kind of beliefs and social practices that we do see occur throughout the film. Okay. Just quickly on the left there, we have the Union, which is the northern states, and on the right is the Confederates, which are the southern states. Okay, so it's often they're called the blues and the greys or the browns. Okay, all right, let's begin. All right, what is the United States? So first thing that might catch your eye there is the flag is quite different. So the stars and the stripes represent different things. You know, we have 50 states now, as it says there. Originally, there were only 13, and each star is for a state. Okay, so each time a state is added, they change the flag slightly and add a new star. The current flag is the longest serving American flag. Okay, so originally there were 13 states. Those were New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, which is the setting for Remember the Titans, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And it's worth noting quite a few of those original states are in the South. Okay. Some parts of the American, well, it originally started as a British colony. That's true for many of the states, okay, including, you know, New York and some of those really key northern states. It was much the same as Australia in that, you know, it was where the British were sending prisoners, or, you know, how they were dealing with their overpopulation problem, as well as trying to kind of extend their power. Okay? Some parts of the Americas, though, were owned, and we say that because obviously we want to acknowledge the Indigenous persons that have resided there prior to British involvement, or American or French or Dutch or Spanish or whoever it is. But the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, you know, held different parts, and that's why parts of Canada speak French, or you know, French is included in Louisiana's language quite a bit, because, you know, those parts were originally kind of controlled by those powers. The same is true of Mexico, and that's why they speak Spanish there. America was not actually discovered by Columbus. That's an often a non-fact, essentially, that's stated. So he landed on Hispaniola, which is near what is now referred to as Haiti. And basically, he's not this, you know, great adventurer we often hear about him. He was actually quite brutal there, enslaved a lot of people, murdered a lot of the local populace. But he did not discover America as we know it. He sailed into what is called the Americas. All right, let's move on. The American War of Independence. So I'm just giving you an idea of what America is before we kind of talk about the Civil War, because the states and the formation of it are quite important. Okay, so this happened way back in the 1700s, where basically the Americans decided they'd have enough of British control and decided to kind of oust them from rule. Okay, so there are a few issues with this on kind of an international scale, from at least the British and other kind of colonial powers perspective. One, it challenges the sovereignty of the king. So that's kind of the right of the king to rule. So his ability to control what's considered under his influence. And, you know, there were these colonial people who in British society were looked down upon, kind of challenging his rule. It also challenges God, because, you know, there was a common belief that the king is kind of God's person on earth, and particularly in the English church, you know, he is the head of the English church as well. So it's also calling into question what is called divine right. which is where it's basically the king is there through the will of God. Okay, and it kind of began over taxation. Okay, so the British were taking quite a lot of money and goods out of America, and maybe weren't putting enough back in. Okay, and they also refused to grant America their own currency, so they weren't allowing America to fully function as a country. Okay, they were very much keeping them as kind of a part of the British Empire and really quite under their control. There were, basically there was a giant war over this. The French helped America quite a bit, and they ended up throwing out the British in 1776, declaring their independence and forming the Constitution, okay, which is basically the basis of their country's culture and their laws. All right, let's move on. Let's just jump forward in history, because there's, almost 100 years of events in between those times. First kind of key event I wanted to talk about was the Louisiana Purchase. So I mentioned earlier that Louisiana, was a French colony, and that was right up until 1803, when Napoleon, so the Emperor of France, sold it to America for, I think it was 175,000 francs or whatever the currency was back then, which translates to a lot of money now, and basically sold massive parts of what is now America to the American government to fund his war against the British, okay, and the Prussians and everyone else he was fighting at that time, okay. In 1808, we have the abolishment of slave importation. So in England, by this time, slavery had been illegal for a very long time. And that's kind of why they wanted to keep their control in America, because they could exploit slavery. But in 1808, Americans stopped bringing new slaves in. That didn't mean that persons already in America wouldn't be enslaved and continued to be enslaved, but they weren't, sailing over to Africa and bringing slaves over. They were enslaving the children of people they had enslaved. Okay. Let's jump forward 42 years to 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, in understanding America, it's very important to note that they are a united group of states, okay? So what that means is their state law is a lot more important or stronger than ours, okay? So each state kind of chooses its own laws. They have capital punishment in some, not in others. There's all kinds of different rules, state to state. And this is kind of what sets the scene for the Civil War and some of the tension we see in Remember the Titans, okay? So by this time, by 1850, lots of northern states did not have active slavery or were pushing against active slavery, whereas in the South, it was still very much a part of their way of life. And in 1850, they passed a law where if slaves ran away from southern states and escaped and hid in the North, if they were captured, they had to be sent back to, the person who owned them or under those laws owned them, okay? And so that was a real bit of tension because people in the North didn't want this happening, but it was put into law. In 1860, so 10 years later, Abraham Lincoln is elected, all right, on the 6th of the 11th. It's interesting because he's kind of the person who pushes through the anti-slavery movement, at least at a government level. But at this time, he was not against slavery in the southern states, at least openly. He said new states, because there's new states coming part of the United States all the time, aren't allowed to have slaves, but those old southern states can keep their slaves and we won't stop slavery there. In Kansas, they kind of went half and half, and it was a bit murky and made things a bit more confusing and led to some more tension. Okay. A month or so after he is elected president, and it's worth noting that Abraham Lincoln did not win the presidential election in a single southern state. Okay, so whilst he won overall, all those votes came from the North. Okay, he did not have a single southern state's majority votes, and that probably shows he didn't necessarily represent their interest, or they felt he didn't, because they very much wanted to keep Southern life the same. So in 1860, just a month later, South Carolina secedes. And what that means is they left that union of states and decided, you know, we're South Carolina, we don't want to be a part of your union because your president and your laws, particularly that push against slavery, don't represent the ideas of South Carolina. Okay? In 1861, the Confederacy is formed. So a whole bunch, you know, just a month or two later, a whole bunch more states leave the Union. And that includes Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Okay? And of course, South Carolina, which started the movement. Virginia and others, including Tennessee, leave later once the war starts in earnest. And Virginia, again, is just where, remember, the Titans is set. So they were part of this Southern Union where slavery was very much alive. And that's probably why we see more of those tensions 100 years later in the setting of our film. Okay? So the war begins officially in December of that year. Okay, so there's kind of a whole year between the secession, between the states leaving and the war beginning. And that begins with the attack on Fort Sumter, which is in South Carolina. So that first state to leave. And basically the Confederates attack this fort because the Union has troops there and they don't feel that's safe for them. Okay. And then, you know, 3 months later, the war kicks up a notch with the Battle of Bull Run, which is the first major battle of the Civil War. Most people thought that this war was going to be one battle and then over. They didn't think it would be a 5-year-long struggle. Okay, so there are all kinds of accounts of people sitting up on the hills with picnics and in deck chairs watching the battle down below. And what happens is the Union, so Abraham Lincoln and the North, absolutely lose. Most people expected them to win because they have a lot more money and weapons and things, but they get completely and utterly beaten at the Battle of Bull Run. And that, I guess, begins this bitter struggle. It's worth noting with the Confederacy that it was only around for 5 years. That's less time than you spend in high school, okay? But it's still, for whatever reason, ingrained in Southern culture, particularly when people are talking about white pride or power, and I guess a lot of those racist movements. And this is, you know, very much where the Ku Klux Klan exists and existed, kind of from this time, and, you know, up until modern day, it still exists in, you know, quite a different fashion, but, you know, still very active. Okay. All right. So here we have the North and the South. So that crossed blue flag on the red is the Confederate flag. Okay. And that's often used as a racist or hate symbol. But, you know, a lot of people do say it connects to Southern pride. And we're seeing a lot of strain, I guess, at the moment where, you know, people are claiming it's offensive to them, whereas others are saying it just represents our history. And that's where we see that kind of those issues at the moment around Confederate statues being torn down, not being torn down, and that kind of push and pull. Okay, so the difference, the northern states were highly industrialized. Okay, they had all the factories, they had all the shipbuilding yards, they had all the modern stuff. Okay, they were typically anti-slavery. All right, they ran more based on a factory kind of model rather than relying on slaves. They were modernized and urbanized. Okay, so much bigger cities, much bigger cities than in the South. They were typically more educated than in the South. And that's because they are, you know, more business focused. The southern states were mostly agrarian, which means it's all farms. So 80% of the workforce in the South worked in a farm. Right? That's a massive proportion. They had a higher proportion of black residents in general than the North, whether they're free or enslaved, because there were free people of color in the South. There were just a lot more slaves. Okay? And they relied on that slave labor because 80%, I guess, of their work is in the farms. They really felt they needed that slave labor to keep their economy going. Okay? And only 35% of the United States railways were in the South. Remember, this is before cars or planes. And the best way to get goods from point A to point B is railways. And they were really, really, you know, a contributive factor to the Confederate loss, that they didn't have these railways. Okay. It's also worth noting that Southerners kind of had this idea of themselves as being friendly, of living a simple, cleaner life than the North, that the North was tricky, you know, that they were gentlemen in the South. All right. The Battle of Antietam. Antietam. I always say that wrong. So this was a real changing point in the war. This is actually a photo. So there was some photography back then, and you know, there's the National Parks kind of group in America have over 500 photos from many of these battles. So this is an actual battle picture, and it's in what is called the Sunken Road, which was, you know, a major part of this battle. And you can see there are countless dead bodies piled up all the way along. And this was a real, I guess, low point of the war. So it was the bloodiest day in American history up to this point. Okay, so there were 23,000 people who were casualties, so either seriously injured or killed in one day in this battle. And that's more deaths than any of America's preceding conflicts. That's the Spanish-American War, French-Indian War, and the War of Independence combined in one day. Okay, so this for them was horrific. And you've got to remember, this isn't a normal war in that, you know, it's Britain and France and they can hate each other because they're a different country. These are people who are related, who know each other, fighting on opposite sides to the death over 5 years. Okay, this led to the Emancipation Proclamation on the 1st of January in 1863. And basically, that was Abraham Lincoln's official end to slavery. So any slave they came across, the Northern armies, the Union armies, they would free, and they could join the Union Army. Okay, so this led to about 20 to 40,000 extra soldiers becoming instantly available for the North. Because up until this point, there were no, you know, people of color allowed in the army. They might have fought unofficially, but the Union Army, which is the North or the South, didn't allow them to fight. Okay, but at this point, after this battle, because so many people died, the North decided, and Abraham Lincoln decided the time was right to make a change to that. And this is really the first big step towards squashing slavery entirely. Okay, this is the South invasion of the North. Up until this point, General Robert Lee, who you might have heard of, he's kind of considered the great Southern gentleman of the war. He was definitely their best performing general. And accounts of whether he definitely had slaves, but accounts of how he treated them differ. And there's a bit of a disagreement on historians over whether he was cruel to slaves or whether, you know, he didn't believe in slavery. But this ended his invasion of the North. Okay, the battle was a draw, but the South lost a heap of men and had to pull out. Okay, which kind of sets the stage for the turning point of the war. This is kind of where things begin to shift. The South had been winning up to this point. Which leads us to the Battle of Gettysburg, which is definitely the most famous American battle of the Civil War, and, you know, probably one of the key occurrences in American history. So this was a major victory for the North. This was essentially the end of the war in terms of military means. So General Lee lost here and the Southern Army never recovered. It gave the North clearance to reach Richmond, which is the capital of the Confederate South. Okay? So when they won this battle, at Gettysburg, they could go in, attack the South's capital, and essentially end the war. There were 60,000 casualties at the battle's end. Remember, just a year or so earlier at Antietam, there were 23,000, and that was more than all of America's history combined. At the Battle of Gettysburg, this one battle, there were 60,000 people died, essentially in a day and a bit. Okay? Yeah, so this was a real victory for the North, but also a loss for America because so many people died. And it's worth mentioning too that these are being fought in people's homes. Gettysburg was a farm area. Okay, so there are people's homes which are copping cannonballs. It's the people who have to clean up the dead bodies the next day, just regular people. Okay, They actually go to Gettysburg. That's where the training college they go to in Remember the Titans is. And there's a scene about that. Okay. What then? So what after the battles of Gettysburg? In 1865, on the 9th of the 4th, the Southern Army under General Lee, who's pictured on the left there in the white suit, surrenders. Okay. And that effectively ends the war. Okay, so there's still a few government issues to work out, but the South is done. They have lost. 1865, just 5 days after this, Abraham Lincoln is shot by John Wilkes Booth. Okay, so because the North won, a group of Southern sympathisers or Southern militants decided to, I guess, strike back, and they kill Abraham Lincoln. And that's part of an effort to stop slavery from ending. Because whilst this war might not have started completely because of slavery, by its end, that is the most, I guess, important factor that they're fighting over. Okay? They also tried to kill his vice president and his head of staff and everything, but those attempts of assassination failed. Okay? And then later that year, right at the end in December, the 13th Amendment is ratified and slavery is now outlawed. Okay, so whilst the North has won and slavery is illegal, in the South, that doesn't mean those opinions are going to change. And you've got to remember that a lot of people, particularly in the South, viewed former slaves, as well as people of colour in general, as property, not as people. Okay, which is something that didn't change in Australian law, or rather, Indigenous persons in Australia weren't viewed as people until the 60s or 70s. Okay, in law of the 1900s. Okay, and so those opinions in America, particularly in the South, were still very present right up till now, where we obviously are seeing, struggles over whether it be statues or landmarks glorifying slave owners, or whether it's, I guess, the Black Lives Matter movement and the tensions there. Okay. So what does this have to do with Remember the Titans? And I'll just quickly move a little head bubble. Remember the Titans is about race struggles. It's about individual struggle, and it's about, I guess, the collective ideas that still were present in that time frame, even though the Civil War ended 100 years before the film setting. Okay? And, it's about overcoming that and people finding out that they have common ground. And that's the connection here. Okay? So your task is outlined in the pack. Miss Callanan or I will take you through it. And I hope you enjoyed part 2 of this little context unit. Miss Callanan will take the next one, and I'll take the final one. All right. Thank you very much for listening.